Hello, my fellow Milanisti. It's time for part 3, a review of the coaches who looked after the team this season, Fonseca and Conceição. As previously mentioned, ownership and a well-known Redbird advisor chose Fonseca in summer 2024. We were told that he would be the man to fuse Futuro and the senior squad, that he would play offensive and possession-based football. As a Milan fan, I only remembered Fonseca for one event, being the coach of Roma that led them to a 4-2 home loss to Spezia in the Coppa d'Italia, where in extra time he famously made a 6th substitution. You heard me right, 6th. And after the game, he came out to the press and said that this would be discussed internally, presumably between his ears. My personal concern was this. Fonseca was obviously intended to represent continuity from Pioli. He would be too fearful, he would be too obedient to question ownership, and that potentially he would only try to exert control on the players themselves. Well, let's take some time and look back at the start of the season. Many said, let's wait 10 games or so to see how he's doing. So let's do that. The first 10 games are as follows: a draw with Torino, a loss to Parma, a draw to Lazio. At this point, the fanbase were in utter panic. This was followed by 3 straight wins, including a much enjoyed victory against Inter at last. Fanbase flipped and thought maybe he's now steadying the ship. However, how best to describe the rest of the fixtures? I think consistently inconsistent. Now let's look into stats. Milan's defense under Fonseca was notably porous. In the first 11 Serie A matches, the team conceded 14 goals, averaging approximately 1.27 goals per game. By mid-November, this number had risen to 20 goals in 15 matches, highlighting ongoing defensive issues. A huge problem with Fonseca's approach was the overutilization of Chicken Royale with mayo. I get it. You spent 2 months chasing this player. You spent 2 months to give Tottenham Hotspur a charitable donation, so you want to use him. But analysis by people way smarter than me indicated that Milan conceded 9 goals from attacks starting from the right side of our defence during Fonseca's tenure. Add to all of this the player confusion. In October, Reindeer acknowledged that something was wrong. He said, "We're starting to understand Fonseca's plan slowly." A frightening demonstration of the lack of clear team progress when you've had a coach for a full pre-season. Fonseca's relationship with key players, particularly Rafa Leao and Theo Hernandez, was strained. Early in the season, both players were benched, leading to speculation about internal discord. Although, of course, Fonseca publicly downplayed all of these issues. However, Rafa Leao publicly expressed frustration over being benched for 3 consecutive games without direct communication from Fonseca. Leao stated, "He didn't speak to me directly, only through conferences." Complete breakdown of player-coach dialogue. Whether you blame Leao or you blame Fonseca, this is no way to run a club. Fonseca was also critical of his team's attitude and commitment. After a 2-1 victory over Red Star Belgrade, he expressed frustration, saying, "I'm tired of struggling with these things. I don't know if everyone in the team can say the same." And then there is the famous drinks break event against Lazio, where Leao and Theo stood away from the rest of the squad in just the 3rd Serie A match day. Some fan bases tried to excuse this, The press tried to make a big deal out of this. However, as you all know, this is not a good look for the club. I give him one credit: stopping the Inter rot. He stopped a run of 6 consecutive losses to Inter with a 2-1 win in the Derby della Madonnina. Grazie tanto anche a Gabbia. I give Fonseca a hugely negative note, and this will surprise a lot of people listening. On the 5th of November 2024, Milan played a game at the Bernabeu against Real Madrid. A game that they would go on to win 3-1 with goals from Ciao, Morata and Reindeer. However, this was also a game that displayed every failing within the club, much more severe than the actual sporting ambition. This was a game where we had a fully foreign starting lineup with a foreign coach. Milan's identity was gone. For me, this game marked the beginning of feeling completely numb towards the club. I realized at this point that ownership had won, that they had filled the squad with several average players from foreign countries, and that Fonseca had openly demonstrated that the promise of youth integration was nothing but a charade. More important than the starting lineup was actually to look at the subs bench. 5 Italian players named on it for no other reason than to fulfill Champions League quota rules. This was a trend that was to continue throughout the season. Finally, on his dismissal on the 29th of December 2024, after a 1-1 draw with Roma, Fonseca was sent out to face the press. He stood there whilst members of the press knew that he had been fired, yet no one stood beside him, had informed him, or gave him the basic decency to tell him not to go out and be humiliated. The manner of the dismissal was widely criticised, and rightly so, for its lack of professionalism and transparency. The decision to have Fonseca address the media without prior knowledge of his dismissal was met with backlash. Even a journalist called Pietro Mazzara criticised the club openly, stating that Fonseca deserves better treatment. Ibrahimovic later publicly apologised for the mishandling. He acknowledged that it was a mistake to have sent Fonseca to the press conference under those circumstances. Fonseca was always a gentleman, but the job was always too big for him. His influence was always going to be zero. The choice was always wrong. And what we found out was that a termination clause had been inserted into his contract, indicating that should he be fired within the first 6 months of his tenure, they would not have to pay out the full duration of his term. Finally, for my score on Fonseca: for leaving us in 8th place in Serie A, for leaving us in 13th place in the Champions League table, but for stopping the rot against Inter, for beating Real Madrid, for willingly and willfully going with everything that management and ownership gave to him, I have to score Fonseca's tenure as 1 out of 10, and a flat grade of an F. He simply could not cope. If you ask me to give an overall summary of his tenure, I'd say this: it was marred by defensive frailties, inconsistent performances, and strained relationships with key players, culminating in a dismissal after less than 6 months in charge. He was always going to be the fall guy, and it shocks me to this day how many think that he was solely the problem. So it's time for us to talk about Sergio Conceicao, a coach that came with a reputation for discipline, for defensive solidity, a coach with knowledge and Champions League pedigree. So how would he cope with this management? How would he cope with this squad? How would he cope with the extremely difficult task at hand of getting Milan back into the Champions League places, but also ensuring that the club made it out of the league phase of the Champions League into the far more lucrative knockout rounds. He was dropped in at the deep end because upon his arrival at Milan, he had to travel to Riyadh in Saudi Arabia. The Italian Super Cup was not a final to be played between the Serie A champions and the Coppa d'Italia champions, but instead had a semi-final phase that included Milan, because of course we had won no cups last season. Rumours being that the fanbase in Saudi and beyond within the region really wanted to see Milan. So a method had to be engineered to enable this to happen. I have made it clear in previous pods that I disagree wholeheartedly with this and that Milan never belonged in that competition. Nevertheless, on the 3rd of January 2025, Milan beat Juventus 2-1. And on the 6th of January 2025, Milan beat Inter Milan in a dramatic 3-2 victory with an Tammy Abraham goal at the death. Trophy number 50 for Milan was secured. It seemed that the squad had some fight in them. It seemed like they wanted to win trophies. It seemed like they wanted to demonstrate grinta, all qualities that some fans associated with Conceicao. However, reality soon came back to bite. Conceicao kept persisting with that 4-2-3-1 formation, conceding plenty of goals, getting many yellow cards for fun, and a stark difference became noticeable between Fonseca and Sergio's reign. Conceicao brought the infighting himself onto the pitch. He famously had to be held back from taking Calabria's head off after Milan's last gasp comeback win to Parma to beat them 3-2. His explanation: if kids are behaving badly, you have to act. How many of you would have guessed that this manager would be unable to resolve the Champions League struggles? On the 29th of January, Milan lost 2-1 to Dinamo Zagreb, a performance marred by Yunus Musa collecting 2 yellow cards and leaving us with just 10 men. A win would have meant automatic qualification to the last 16 of the Champions League. But surely things could not get worse. Fast forward to the 12th of February and Feyenoord win 1-0 after an absolute goalkeeping howler by Mike Maignan. More worryingly, Milan looked fragile. But the fans said to themselves, we just spent a ton of money on Santi Jimenez. Surely Feyenoord cannot come to our house and beat us there, or even match us. On the 18th of February, we got our answer. Jimenez scored in the first minute. We were in business. Only that, we weren't. The team became nervous, and as the minutes ticked by, their fear became palpable. On the 73rd minute, the equaliser came, which in the end sealed a 2-1 aggregate win. Milan were embarrassingly out of Europe. Next, Conceicao switched his attention to the league and the Coppa d'Italia. Goals kept being conceded, and the same consistent inconsistency continued. Highlights? Perhaps Milan's 3-0 win over Inter in the Coppa d'Italia second leg on the 23rd of April, a result that appeared to confirm Jovic as a starting player. Chicken Royale picked up a serious injury in January. His awful performances meant that he was earmarked for a loan or sale, but this was ruled out. This injury, among others and suspensions, saw the emergence of Alex Jimenez, the former Futuro player who had come to us from Real Madrid. For the most part, for the rest of the season, he did okay, although Conceicao, of course, deployed him in several different positions. Our league position was not improving, and the pressure on Conceicao started to build. At this point, his defense statement became, "How many coaches at Milan have won 2 trophies?" A mantra repeated by Furlani when he embarrassingly compared Conceicao to Ancelotti. But let's leave Forlani out of this. He will have his own review soon enough. Milan had qualified for the final of the Coppa d'Italia against Bologna, a team that honest Milanisti knew would be very dangerous, as they had limited resources but a project and a clear playing style. Of course, we know how that turned out. Perhaps out of sheer desperation or a need to do something, Conceicao switched to a 3-4-3 formation, and hilariously, some thought that this would be the change to fix our defensive issues. So many hung on to the fact that despite Milan being in 9th position, they could now pull off a miracle. Of course, playing with 3 centre-backs and having right and left backs able to join the defence means that you should be able to park the bus. But the central midfield solidity is only partially masked by numbers of bodies in the box. Of course, when push came to shove, Milan lost crucial games in the league against Lazio, Atalanta, Napoli and Roma. Now, let's put some numbers on Conceição's tenure. In total, he had 31 games in charge in all competitions, 16 wins, 10 losses, 5 draws. They scored 50 goals and conceded a not insignificant 36. In Serie A, Conceição conceded an average of 1.3 goals per game, taking Milan to a final position of 8th place and out of any European competition. For his Super Cup, I have to give him at least a 2 out of 10 and an E. But his tenure has been marked by angry outbursts, inconsistent performances, subs were once again too little too late, and in crucial games he was outthought and outcoached. Perhaps one of the most shocking data points is this. When we look at the season in its entirety, between Fonseca and Conceição, 100 yellow cards were given to Milan players and 5 straight red cards. I hope you enjoyed that, guys. Get ready for the final part next week. It's time for Forlani and Jerry.